So let's start, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Bertelsmann Stiftung, I welcome you to this World Economic Forum trade conversation on WTO reform. My name is Andreas Esche, and I have the privilege to be your chair for this session. The crisis of the WTO has been unresolved for a long time. One blow keeps adding to the other. Just within the last 6 months, the organization has to deal with the demise of the appellate body, massive trade intervention.
Andreas, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're not live yet. Just give it 1 second.
Oh, you told me that. So I start over again. That's great. So I'm waiting for another chat. Okay. So we may start now, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Bertelsmann Stiftung, I'd like to welcome you to this World Economic Forum trade conversation on WTO reform. My name is Andreas Esche, and I have the privilege to be your chair for this session. The crisis of the WTO has been unresolved for a long time. One blow keeps adding to the other. Just within the last 6 months, the organization has to deal with the demise of the appellate body, massive trade interventions in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the postponement of a much-awaited ministerial conference, and finally the resignation of its Director General, Roberto Azevedo. With the blows becoming more severe and more frequent, it is increasingly urgent that the WTO is updated and be put into a position that it can deliver. What is needed for WTO reform is more political buy-in from member states, so big projects can be undertaken that prove the organization's worth. Making this happen should rank high on the agenda of the next DG. What needs to be done then? The misery of the WTO is most visible when it comes to dispute settlement, which is also where many of the ailments of the last month started. While the MPIA is an interim stand-in for the appellate body is now in place, no rules-based system can exist without the broadest possible rule enforcement mechanism. So I'm happy that Petros Mavroidis will provide us with some insights which issues in dispute settlement should be addressed in a few minutes. The next issue should be harvesting low-hanging fruits and paving the way towards reform-generating reforms. Therefore, the efficiency of working practices in the WTO needs to be improved. Such operative reforms can increase the value of the WTO to its member states and thus lead to more political buy-in, which is needed. Wolfe shares some of his ideas on this in a moment. Perhaps most importantly, the WTO needs to address head-on one of the biggest concerns of the membership, dealing with industrial subsidies. This was already a priority before COVID-19 pandemic, but has even increased in importance. Now we're all non-market economies. State aid and subsidies are being applied on a massive scale to prevent job losses, which is likely to result in overcapacity and attempts of dumping in the aftermath of the crisis. How to deal with this is complicated, to say the least. Kamala Dawar is an expert on subsidies and their effect on trade, and I'm delighted to welcome her to this discussion. Finally, much of the substantial agenda is not feasible if the WTO does not get its act together. Here, the role of the DG must not be underrated. What are the most pressing issues a new DG has to tackle? Is it subsidies? Is it plurilateral agreements? We get some answers from new empirical research. Bernard Hoekman will present us as the last speaker of this session. Finally, I'd like to introduce Christian Bluth, who is coordinating the research activities of Bertelsmann Stiftung on WTO reform. Today, you will monitor the questions you are posting, hopefully on YouTube, and intervene later to relate them to the panelists and facilitate the Q&As at the end of the session. So now let's get started. Petros, the virtual floor is yours. Now, yes, now we can hear you, I think. Great.
Just a second, because I have to make sure that I share screen. Excellent. There we are. Okay, so this is more or less what I want to speak about. I want to address 2 points. First of all, very briefly, why we've moved from euphoria to dysphoria, because this can inform the second part of the discussion, which is how can we get out from the current deadlock? And here I want to discuss both the options on the table and the options that should find their way to the table. Bernard and myself, we've been working on this for a couple of years now, and we're not very happy with the agenda we see on the table. Now, the proximate cause why we moved to dysphoria is, of course, the attitude of the Trump administration, the refusal to renew judges or appoint new judges at the appellate body. I mean, this is not a self-contained crisis, because the moment you have no appeals, you can have no appellate body, you have appeals to the void. So you have no panels either. But the key thing here is we ran a survey to see to what extent the US was alone in its view, or whether others shared. And we find out that although nobody agrees with the course of action adopted by the US administration, a number of people share a number of the concerns that the US has voiced. Now, these concerns, some of them found their way in the long-running DSU review and internal process to improve WTO dispute adjudication, which for a number of reasons didn't manage to provide any solutions, largely because there was absolutely no organization of the whole process. A last-ditch attempt, the so-called Walker process, could not bring sunshine to the WTO either. So we ended up where we ended up. And the question is, how can we get out from here? And of course, the obvious response is, well, if the big guys sit down and there is enough political will, maybe we have the basis to get out. Then all we need is a plan. But there are signs in this direction, but just signs. So where are we now in terms of tangible options? Well, there is, of course, the MPIA, the Multi-Party Interim Appeal Arbitration Agreement, which is an initiative spearheaded by the European Union, to some extent, China, Canada, and so on, 21 members in total. Some sort of short-term appeal mechanism until we fix the appellate body crisis. There are a number of problems. Problem number one, this is not WTO-wide. 21 out of 164, even if one of the 21 counts for 27 now, following Brexit, is not enough. It's not even 1/3. Second, the guys who miss are not small guys, they're big guys. US to start with, India, and so on and so forth. Japan. I mean, this is not something that apparently makes unanimity in the WTO. Now, what should the WTO trading community think about? Where could it be inspired from? I mean, of course, the first question to ask is the crisis, the appellate body crisis. And there the question should not necessarily, in our view at least, be how do I redress the appellate body, but it should be, do I need an appellate body? The appellate body was not given much thought during the Uruguay round, and its objective function essentially was increased depoliticization of the adjudication process. I don't like very much the word legalization because, quite frankly, I don't know what it means. Now, what does an appellate body do? Well, an appellate body increases depoliticization because we embed third-party adjudication and we provide some consistency in case law. Fine, but do we need an appellate body to have consistency? No, it all depends on how we design even a one-instance adjudication. If, for example, we go back to the old European Union idea to have permanent panelists, we restrict the number to 10, 15 people, and we say the plenum will decide all important cases and criteria similar to the criteria that the US Supreme Court accepts cases to adjudicate, then there is absolutely no need for the appellate body, because the key element here is how do I consolidate third-party adjudication, not whether I should have one or two instances body. Now, to do all this, and this is my last point, our last point essentially, because everything I said is joint work with Bernard, to do all this, we have to do something in the WTO which we never did before, that is invest in organizational structures. We sat down together and we checked all of the history of dispute adjudication from 1948 until now. Quite frankly, there has never been a serious discussion about how should we organize adjudication. In 1979, there is a codification after years of trial and error of practice, and this codification of 1979 becomes the prime input for the negotiations of the DSU in 1986, 1994. And the afterthought, the appellate body, which we found traces of discussions in 4 short meetings during the Uruguay round. This is not enough. I mean, what needs to be done is we need to sit down and think seriously about how we want to have adjudication organized at the WTO. There are many, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of examples around. The WTO can be inspired by all sorts of paradigms, from investment tribunals to more permanent courts. But what you need to do is this time to sit down and work seriously on details. How should organization of dispute adjudication take place? In a paper with Bernard 2020, we have a number of suggestions. I can go into them later in the Q&A session, and I stop my short introduction here.
Thank you very much, Petros. Please, to the auditors, not auditors, to the people listening outside, pose your questions on YouTube, because I think that's an excellent panel, which is hardly to assemble a second time like this so quickly. So please, I move now to Robert Wolfe. Floor is yours, Bob.
Okay. Well, good morning or good afternoon for those of you in Europe. I think what I have to say follows on rather neatly from Petros. He talked about the big political issues that everybody is very interested in at the moment. But as Andreas said, there is a lot of low-hanging fruit. There are lots of things about WTO plumbing that can be fixed and can be fixed now. And they should be fixed now because they matter in the response of the trading system to the current crisis. In a crisis like this, members need to keep themselves informed of what's going on with trade policy. They need to review implementation of existing obligations. They need informal opportunities to share their experience. And to do all that, enhancing the conduct of virtual meetings I think is rather important. In conclusion, I'll talk about some of the things the General Counsel actually could do right now without waiting for ministers to meet. So information. As we know, notifications are a central issue for WTO reform. We know that compliance with existing obligations is at best uneven. There's been a proposal on the table for a couple of years now from the United States that basically says we should punish countries, we should have sanctions on countries who don't comply with their notification obligations. In the work we've done, we take a different tack. Of course, if the reason for poor compliance is bad faith, then sanctions could be appropriate. But in many cases, the problem is capacity, which means technical assistance could be more important. And perhaps in the largest number of cases, the obligations themselves, written 25 years ago, in some cases may no longer make a terrific amount of sense. And so committee by committee, members should be asking themselves, whether the information they're now getting is in fact inadequate for their purposes. And they should be thinking about whether there are ways that that information can be provided in ways that are less burdensome. The Ottawa group, in its most recent meeting, talked about some of these issues. For example, that measures introduced in response to the crisis should be promptly notified, and that economic support measures, and there's been all kinds of them, of course, in the crisis, should be included in the trade monitoring reports. The latest Secretariat monitoring report is a little depressing from that standpoint. Only 29% of members shared their COVID-19 related support measures. The annex on general economic support is still not possible. It's been years since they could do it because members aren't providing the information. So this is an area where active engagement of members in doing better is rather important. Second area is managing conflicts. And the basic proposition is that if you have an opportunity to talk about trade conflicts in some kind of WTO committee, then you can manage that conflict before you actually need dispute settlement. All the more important if dispute settlement is not working very well. And of course, even more important still, when there's tremendous potential for conflicts because of the pandemic crisis. So what's the working practices problem here? Well, when you look committee by committee, most committees do have a basic review of notifications. Some have questions about notifications, and a few have something that looks like a formal specific trade concern process. Every committee has minutes of its meetings, but in some cases, those minutes are not very detailed. Often, committees have a process where questions can be posed in writing, and then the answer can be posed in writing, but they're not in a database, as is the case in SPS and TBT, and increasingly in agriculture. And being able to search a database can be quite important for understanding an issue. And what's also striking is the largest traders, for example, the most active users of the dispute settlement system, are also the most active users of the STC process. So there are at least two reform objectives. First is simply to raise the number of members who are able to use the STC process to resolve trade conflicts. And the second is to make that process more effective for all members. In the working paper that we did on this, I focused on a proposal by the EU and 19 other members on new guidelines for WTO bodies. This proposal talks in detail about meeting arrangements, how you can make it easier for Geneva delegations who need to consult capitals by more advanced preparation. What the proposal doesn't talk about is annotated agendas. Sounds like a mundane thing, but if you get an annotated agenda 2 or 3 weeks before a meeting, you understand why an item is on the agenda, why a specific trade concern has been raised, and that makes it easier for capitals to prepare. The proposal encourages written questions and answers. It could go farther. If in every case, a question and its answer are online ahead of a meeting, then officials and capitals can be well prepared, and they can even, in effect, be interacting with each other through the WTO without even having to come to Geneva. And that ability to interact without physical participation is all the more important when travel is so difficult. We see this most spectacularly in the e-agenda system being used in TBT and increasingly in SPS. Last month, they basically had a documents-based meeting on specific trade concerns without anybody having to be in a physical meeting room. The Committee on Agriculture is moving in a similar direction. A key proposal, and should be emphasized, and the Secretariat can be working on this now, and should be, is first making sure that every committee has a database for trade concerns like SPS and TBT, but also making sure that those databases are all integrated. It should be possible for delegates and for businesses to search on an issue, see all of the ways it's come up in the WTO without needing to know which committee it had been raised in. Third thing that we've done some research on is opportunities for dialogue. The Ottawa group in its statement said that intensified engagement with stakeholders is important to better inform policymaking. We have advice on how to do that, which is more informal thematic meetings, that allows committees to hear from the people who use their agreements, including regulators in business and other IOs. That should be particularly important at the moment, understanding the novel trade policy challenges that have been posed by the crisis is something that could be discussed in an informal meeting with stakeholders from capitals and business before actually getting to the point of thinking whether formal proposals are needed. Thematic sessions are sponsored by or associated with the WTO body, but aren't part of its formal meetings. And there's all sorts of terms that have been applied to them, workshops, experience sharing sessions, and so on. There were over 100 that we found in the 3 years to December 2019. Fewer of those sessions are on issues not now well covered at WTO, and that should be changed. There should be a lot more of those forward-looking sessions, and bodies that have never held one should think about it. What was also striking was that barely a third of capital-based speakers in these informal meetings came from non-G20 members. More funding for speakers from a central budget might alleviate that problem, but increased use of video conferencing technology could also be quite valuable. Reform in this dimension and in the use of STCs is happening in real time. Ottawa Group ministers met online, the Committee for Trade and Goods and the Market Access Committee held virtual meetings last month. Some people in the room, some people online. Committee of Agriculture has done the same thing. We are observing that members are obviously becoming more comfortable with the Interprofy technology that the Secretariat is using. And they're using that because it's secure, but also because it allows online interpretation. Everybody can follow a meeting in the same language they could in a WTO meeting room. What they're finding also is that while this software is good for discussion, there is reluctance to allow formal decisions to be made. So you can take virtual meetings only so far before people have to be in a meeting room again. So to conclude, there are some things the General Counsel could simply decide to do right now. They could instruct every committee to review its notification obligations. They could create an integrated database. They could create a central budget for capital-based participation in meetings. And they could ensure that all necessary support is there for more virtual meetings. Those are decisions that could be taken. Committees, of course, are master of their own process, but the General Counsel could create guidelines for committees to follow them on documentation, on agendas, using the e-agenda system, and of course, for going farther with virtual participation in their meetings. And all the underlying research for what I've just been talking about is available on the Bertelsmann website. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Before we move on, I'd just like to remind you, and for some of you who joined us during this presentation, give you the information that please use YouTube comments to pose your questions, which will be addressed after the presentations. Now, on disciplines on expert subsidies and guarantees, we move to Kamala Dawar from Sussex University. Please, Kamala, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I'm going to speak to some research that I undertook as part of the Horizon 2020 project. It's really discussing how governments support their domestic exporters through providing guarantees or insurance or loans to a foreign buyer of goods or services. Now, traditionally, this was very much a lender of last resort role for governments because the commercial sector was quite robust until 2008. And then the onset of the crisis, a lot more export credit activity took place from governments because of the liquidity crisis in the financial sector. Now you can see here that among the OECD participants, there was a spike around 2012, but there's still quite a lot of activity under the OECD. And then the newcomers to the scene are the BRICS. And you can see here that China is really a significant player now in export credit activity. And this is unsettled the regulation of these export supports. So what are the changes? In the olden days, pre-financial crisis, the model was really based around the US Ex-Im The G7 really dominated export credit agency support. It was a very defensive leader of last resort position. They were only allowed to support in cases of market failure where the commercial sector wasn't offering this support, and they had to break even. And it was basically around a single transaction or one contract. And this was tied strictly to national interests with domestic content, and that was a proxy, seen as a proxy for employment. Now, all of these G7 countries were part of the OECD arrangement and common approaches which look at sustainability and due diligence, as well as making sure that there isn't a race to the bottom in subsidy through export support. However, what's happened since 2008 and the financial crisis is that really it's competing with China. So export agencies that were generally conforming to the OECD principles started thinking that they had to start doing something innovative to actually keep up with China, because China is not a member of the OECD, and nor is India and some of the other BRICS. So this is very much now a new approach where they go out and they find deals to create, and they have a whole diverse range of programs which reflects this whole of government approach. So we see blurring objectives. Development finance is now used for the same reasons as export finance, to actually support exporters, domestic exporters. It's no longer about exports. It's about creating those national champions. And because these programs are moving outside of the OECD arrangement, and so are the actors, the WTO Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement is becoming the focal point for regulation. Now, I don't have to talk more about the problems with the WTO because that's already been addressed. I just want to discuss how much of this activity is now taking place outside of the OECD arrangement. So you can see increasingly unregulated export credits, market windows, untied support, investment support, and development finance activity is being blurred to use for the same objectives of export credits. And the export credit arrangement under the OECD is becoming much less relevant. And this was before the trade war. So we know that China has been really pushed. Sinasur has had to have sort of record payouts because of claims that came about because of the trade war and US companies not picking up Chinese goods and services. And there is not much data available on the response from export credit agencies with COVID. The OECD has been trying again through surveys only to OECD members, and you can see that there's been considerably more activity than we would expect if there wasn't a pandemic. So a lot of pressure is going on to the public purse to actually use taxpayers' money to finance these activities, and much less due diligence and much less regulation is going on to make sure that there aren't negative aspects attached to them. So the conclusion of the research so far is really like, how do we, in the post-Washington consensus, where, as I think Andreas said, we're all non-market economies now, who is regulating? The shifts in the market and the industry mean that these new products are not being regulated by the OECD arrangement and common approaches, even when they're OECD members that are establishing these programs. No due diligence. The OECD arrangement is becoming marginalized by these new actors and the new scope of these other activities, and compliance is just not evaluated under the OECD or in the EU for that matter. I think it's clear that the WTO SCM is really not fit for purpose here. It's not a suitable successor for the OECD arrangement, doesn't have those detailed provisions, doesn't have the common approaches on environmental, social and human rights, doesn't monitor properly, as we know, bilateral enforcement. So it's very much about a political decision whether or not to take a dispute over this. There's only been 2 disputes since '96, which is indicative of the lack of appetite if most members who have export credit agencies are not complying. And there's no clear jurisprudence on whether they're actionable. The question is whether these increased pressures are going to lead to more progress in the International Working Group on export credit agencies. And that's what we would hope for, because it's clear we need a plurilateral solution to this. Not all WTO members have export credit agencies. It's a rich club. And so there is a real case for a plurilateral group to provide a proper successor for the OECD arrangement in this post-Washington consensus world. So I'll just stop there.
Here we go. Thank you very much, Kamala. Really interesting topic and subject. Now finally we move to Bernard, and he will tell us something about this enormous task which is waiting for a new general director, and what people think about what this task should be. So Bernard, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Let me also share my screen. Okay, so what I thought I would do, originally I was going to talk about plurilateral agreements. I'll come back to that in the course of the next few minutes. But we've just run a survey of the trade practitioner community, which really digs into a number of the topics on which others have spoken before. So whether it's dispute settlement, institutional reforms of the WTO, dealing with subsidies. So I thought it would be interesting to get a sense of what the community as a whole tends to prioritize. And this was put in the context of the selection of the next DG, but a lot of the questions really tried to drill down on these substantive issues, which we've been talking about in this session. So let me just take you through that quickly. The survey was sent to all members of WTO delegations in Geneva. It was also sent to a contact list that we have developed over time, which essentially brings together a lot of people who are either working on trade policy, who are researching trade policy, who are in the business community, business associations, who are all have an interest on trade policy. So we had over 1,000 people who opened the survey. A little over 800 answered most of the questions. And the respondents kind of break down into about half are government business, people associated with business associations, companies, and the other half of the sample is more civil society, international organizations, academia, NGOs. There's a working paper that describes in great detail, rather gory detail, the answers to all the questions. So you can look at that. It's posted on the EUI website in Cadmus. I have the reference here. There's also a VoxEU article that summarizes part of the responses to the survey, and there'll be another VoxEU column appearing tomorrow, which deals with the remaining sets of questions which we couldn't address in the first article. So what comes out of the survey in terms of these substantive issues? So for the sample as a whole, so again, this is around 800 experts, people who work on trade. The number one issue in terms of heading into the next year and a half or so, or 2 years, is to conclude the plurilateral negotiations, discussions, right? Number two, not surprisingly, and this is something Kamala and Andreas have also mentioned, monitoring what governments have been doing with respect to getting us out of the COVID-19 pandemic-related collapse of economies. Number three, deal with outstanding issues that are still leftovers from the Doha round, in particular fish subsidies and some of the agricultural support issues that were part of the Doha round negotiation. And number four, we have subsidies, dealing with the subsidy agenda. Now, what you can see from the bar chart here on the left-hand side is there isn't a whole lot of difference in the extent to which respondents assign priority to these issues. All four of them are seen as high priorities. And in fact, most of the issues that we asked people about are considered to be priority issues to address. The one exception is to launch discussions on new issues, right? So the one way of interpreting that is that the collective view is there's already more than enough on the table. You know, we don't need anything more to be added to that table. So let's focus on the things that we know are important and that we are to a significant extent already dealing with. The right-hand side of this particular slide gives you a sense of who agrees with whom, right? So here we've broken up the set of respondents into different groups, right? Whether you're with the private sector, whether you're a government official in Geneva, whether you're a government official in a capital, and allocate people across geographic regions. And the darker the shade of these rows and vertical columns means the greater the disagreement that particular group has with the average view of the sample as a whole. And what comes out of this is that you can see that NGOs tend to have a different perspective on what priorities are than other people. And there's also quite a bit of difference for some of the regions, but we shouldn't pay too much attention to those because the number of respondents from some of those regions are very small. Now, what's interesting here is that NGOs have a different view, right? So for them, the number one issue is to figure out how does trade help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, right? And that's certainly not something we're getting from the trade people in Geneva or in capitals. For Geneva officials, the number one issue here is to actually deal with these leftovers from the Doha round, which they've been working on very hard and trying to conclude, in particular the fish and agricultural arena. So 90% of all officials who filled out the survey in Geneva said this is a very high priority, right? So for them, that's the number one issue. And the other thing that's interesting about this particular set of questions is that everybody agrees on let's not overload the agenda even more. So launching discussions on new issues is really not a priority for anybody. Right, so again, so the thing to keep in mind is plurilaterals come out first on this and monitoring of what governments are doing. But again, there's a lot of commonality in terms of the priorities according to these first four issues. Now, if we then ask about the types of issues that Bob Wolfe was talking about, institutional reform priorities, right? And Petros, of course, on the appellate body and dispute settlement. What comes out very clearly is that dealing with this dispute settlement problem is the number one priority for everybody, pretty much, right? So 80% of all respondents rate this as high to very high, but there are some interesting twists to this because we asked two questions. One is, how important is it to resuscitate the appellate body? And the second question on dispute settlement was, how important is it to actually engage in a process of thinking about reform of dispute settlement and revisiting the role of appellate review, which is really the topic that Petros was talking about. And you see that governments in capitals don't really make a big distinction between those two. They just want this dispute settlement issue to be resolved. Whereas people in Geneva delegations are very focused on bringing the appellate body back and devote much less of a priority to having a discussion about dispute settlement reform, the role of appellate review, right? So here there is, I think we can say from the respondents, from the responses, there's a difference between Geneva and the rest of the world. And I think this is one of the challenges for the next DG to address is, how do you get people in Geneva to focus less on appellate body, and think about this in a broader way, in a way that was briefly discussed by Bob in terms of thinking through, there are other ways in which you can address disputes. You can try and diffuse disputes. Or along the lines of what Petros was talking about, we really can think and should be thinking about different approaches towards actually strengthening the dispute settlement mechanism in a way that some of the concerns that have been raised by the US get addressed. So that's one, I think, interesting outcome of the survey. The other thing I find quite interesting is that the number one issue for the NGO representatives and labor organizations that answered the survey is they think focusing on the distributional effects of national trade policies on other countries, so focusing on spillover effects of what countries are doing, but also in terms of distribution, income distributional implications of that for them is the number one priority. Right now, it's the last priority for governments. All right, so again, here you see a real conflict in terms of what people think should be the priority looking forward. And I'm just going to put it here. We can talk about why that might be the case. Everybody will have their own hypotheses, of course, but nonetheless. For Africa, for respondents in Africa, the #1 priority was trade policy monitoring. And I think this kind of links into the subsidy issues, because if you think about who actually has the capacity to subsidize, as Kamala was saying, we're not going to find many African countries who can do this, right? So for them, what the sense I get from the survey is a concern that we should be monitoring, controlling what other countries are doing because it might have negative implications for us. And then finally, very quickly, we also had some questions on daily operations in terms of reform. And a lot of that focused on the role and the use of video conferencing, the type of things we're doing now, which has historically been somewhat resisted, if not strongly resisted, by delegations, at least some delegations in Geneva, and Bob can speak to that much better than I can if there are questions on this. But there's a very strong sense that the WTO really should be doing much more in terms of when they provide training and technical assistance, that they should use these new technologies. There's also a pretty strong sense among the sample as a whole that there should be more of a focus on allowing decisions to be taken if there are video conferencing facilities used, and that in general, making video conferencing a standard option is something that is supported. However, there is quite a difference here between the sample as a whole and Geneva, right? So many of the Geneva delegations are much less enthusiastic about decision-making when video conferencing is being used, and everyone puts voting on operational matters as much less of a priority than introducing video conferencing into the day-to-day work of the WTO. So there is a lot more to be said, and we actually have written a lot more on all of these issues collectively. Many of the papers that we've been speaking to are available on the Bertelsmann Stiftung website, and I've put the link here. It's a bit long and impossible probably to remember, but I think it's also on the YouTube chat, so you can just click on it. There's also a Horizon 2020 research project that Kamala mentioned, where a lot of the papers on subsidies, including on export credit and export credit agencies that she's been working on, you can find those papers there. And again, we have a working paper on the survey that you can download from the EUI website if you're interested in digging into the details of what is coming out of that survey. So let me end there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Thanks to all speakers. I think we heard 4 excellent presentations. And now let me turn to Christian Blut. Christian, what have we got so far, and what kind of questions came up?
Yes, hello. So we've had actually a fair share of really good questions on the YouTube chat. So the first is addressed to Petros, and someone asked whether there are sort of inspirations for the design of dispute settlement in other organizations that we can draw upon. Then on the whole subject of subsidies monitoring and also the governance of subsidies, the rulemaking that is related to that, there is a question how efforts in other international organizations can be interwoven or intertwined with what the WTO is maybe already doing or what it should be doing. And the third question is about how can we place the important subject of WTO reform higher on the political agenda? What needs to happen in the larger constellation of things so that this reform is actually sort of getting the impetus that it needs? And the question particularly referenced the G20 forum and the role it can play there. Please, over to you.
Thanks, Christian. Before we go back to the speakers to answer those questions, I'd like to kind of stimulate you to use the time, the remaining time, to pose your questions use it wisely. Petros, I think you've got the first one. Now we have to, we don't hear you yet. There we go.
Now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Excellent.
So I'll be brief. I'll make 4 short points. The first point is one thing that changed following the advent of a WTO is how we deal with practice in order to improve the existing legal framework. I mean, look at the GATT. In 1966, they say, well, we have to do something to make sure developing countries' panelists participate in disputes with panels. This came from practice. They realized people were not sensitive to their needs. 1979, they say, well, we've been doing now dispute settlement for 30 years. What have we learned? Let's put it in a piece of paper. Comes WTO, this stopped from one day to the other. So many things happened in practice after 1995, and none of them has been crystallized in one single, what in legalese, understanding. Now, this is something that must change. The other things that I mean, inspirations, I don't think it makes sense to look into one forum only, but when I say it's wrong, this is the paper with Bernard. Bernard and me, we don't think we should look into one paper only. WTO should be inspired by the best practices. And I'll make 3 points here very briefly. We love the European Union Article 257 committee. And this for the WTO would be particularly important. A look at the WTO appellate bodies from the first to the second to the third. First appellate body, everybody brings more or less the 18. Then they start appointing consistently governmental officials. The moment the first WTO member did that, everybody followed. One committee which will select wheat from chaff and say, these are guys who can and these are guys who cannot. We think is necessary for the WTO. Otherwise, we'll end up with hacks everywhere. The second point I think, which is very important, is independence. In the WTO, we care too much about impartiality. Makes sense. Judges should be impartial, but we must make sure that they are also independent, and not independent only from the nominator, the WTO member appointing, but independent from the other functions of the WTO. We cannot continue to have the Secretariat have essentially the upper hand in deciding who these people are in over 60% of the cases. We need to make sure that these guys own their decisions. And this is why we would like to have permanent panelists, one term, who appoint their own clerks, as it happens both in Luxembourg and in Washington, DC, to avoid Secretariat people who work with delegations on specific cases, advise panels on exactly the same cases a couple of days later. And the third thing is we have to be a little bit more realistic about the process. It doesn't make any sense to ask panels to do disputes in 6 months and the appellate body in 3 months. These are unheard of deadlines. There is not one single. We checked arbitral tribunals practice from ICSID to you name it, Stockholm, Singapore, and so on. We didn't find one jurisdiction that wraps up in such a short deadline. And practice in the WTO proved these are totally unrealistic. In the data set we have with Bernard, the average time for panels is something like 16 point something months, and then the statutory is 6. I mean, this cannot be. And this takes me back to my first point, and with this I stop. If we were in the GATT times, 10, 15 years down the road, somebody would have said, wait a second, we got it wrong back in 1995. We were way too optimistic. Maybe we should move back to reality and stop being in la-la land. We cannot do those things in 6 months. Nobody did in the WTO. This provoked the anger of the US, and so on. The rest is history.
Thank you, Petros. We move down the line. Bob. It's your turn. Please pop up your mic. Yes.
Okay. Well, I know Kamala has things to say about who can do subsidies monitoring. Let me say only that Global Trade Alert has been doing a lot of subsidies monitoring, and that is valuable work because they pick up all sorts of things that countries choose not to tell the WTO. But there's also a big issue of what should be monitored. And we have a number of papers in our Bertelsmann project on rethinking subsidies and how to monitor them and what matters. But that's a whole other presentation. On a role for the G20, I'm in promoting WTO reform, I'm dubious. We've had endless calls from small groups of ministers and large groups of ministers and from the G20 to get on with WTO reform. Fundamentally, this is something members have to do themselves. And if they want to do it, they can do it. And if they choose not to do it, then more calls from the G20 probably isn't going to help. Unless the G20 could somehow get into the plumbing and say, we think WTO should do X, Y, and Z, but the G20 is not well placed to do that, partly because it's not really a representative group of members. So I don't think there is a way that international political pressure is going to help.
Okay, shall I
Yes,
jump in
go
there?
on. Yes, sure.
Thank you. I just wanted to talk about how things could be done within the existing framework for example, export support subsidies. Now, the OECD does collect information from its members of the arrangement. However, you have to be invited to be a member of the OECD arrangement, which seems a bit, I'm not surprised that China has turned down the invitation. Brazil's wants to be invited, but the US has vetoed that. So there's a lot more the OECD could do to try and get the information out there that they do collect. The EU is the interesting one because they're so tough on short-term state aid and they're so relaxed on medium to long-term state aid. They accept what the member states set out in their self-evaluation activity reports. Now, for me, that doesn't seem to make sense at all, given how concerned the EU is with the level playing field. So the EU could evaluate those reports and actually investigate them a bit more. And I'm sure that's in their that's within their competency.
That was a quick one. Bernard, any comments on those questions?
Yeah, let me briefly pick up both of them. So on what role international organizations could play with respect to monitoring of subsidies and kind of helping governments figure out where to go, I think there's a big role here for international organizations beyond the WTO. And I think this is a general thing that is coming out of a lot of the research, is insofar as issues are increasingly no longer kind of simple border measures, and certainly that's the case for subsidies, you're going to have to bring in, and especially when we're talking about regulatory types of issues, you're going to have to bring in the regulators. Right, so a lot of those regulators are already organized internationally. There's a lot of regulatory cooperation going on in different domains. And often that is organized around international agencies, organizations. And in the subsidy area, of course, we have the International Monetary Fund, we have the World Bank that is engaged with all of its member countries in terms of public financial monitoring, accountability, et cetera. So there's a huge amount of firepower in terms of both information and analytical capacity, which is not really being utilized. And I think the big question is, how do you incentivize that? How do you get that going? And I think here the G20 does have a role to play. Now, I agree with Bob that you don't want to get into the WTO weeds through the G20, but the G20 is originally a platform that came out of the finance world, right? It's ministers of finance that have been doing this for a long time. They have a very keen interest, certainly in the subsidy arena, but also industrial policy. So there is a trade and investment working group that has been created by the G20. And one of the unique features about this working group is it brings in all of the international organizations, right? So in a sense, that becomes a fulcrum or a focal point where you can actually launch a work program and where you can tell these organizations, this is what we want you to do. Now, the challenge, of course, is getting all of the G20 to agree on anything, and that is not going to happen. But I think given that these are issues which really concern the large trading powers, they can, and I would argue should, use the G20 Trade and Investment Working Group process to actually start a process of analysis based on existing data, but also to try and identify where are there gaps in the type of data we need, and kind of get a process going where we can focus on the types of issues that Kamala in particular raised, which revolve around subsidies and subsidy-related types of policies. Now, where might that end up, and how do you bring that to the WTO? I think that's where this plurilateral kind of option is important, right? We don't need 164 countries to agree on many of these issues. What we really need is for the US, the EU, China, Japan, India, the large players to agree. And if they all can't, as long as you have a critical mass in a number of these areas, that shouldn't be that difficult. Maybe we can make progress in moving along, including on issues related to WTO reform. Right? But I think the key thing here is that this is one way of actually dealing with some of the substantive challenges.
Andreas, can I just jump back in for a moment? I agree completely with Bernard's point that to make progress on substantive issues, finding ways for interested small groups to talk among themselves works and can work very well. And then you find a way to bring it back to WTO, including through plurilaterals. My comment about the G20 was on institutional reform issues, where there's too many countries in Geneva who would want to have a voice who would not play into the G20. So it's not proved effective, and I don't think it would be effective on the institutional dimension as opposed to the substantive dimension.
Thanks, Bob. I now finally turn again to Christian. Are we done with the questions, or are there new ones coming up?
We have received 2 more questions in the meantime. So one, I think, is meant for Kamala, which asks about export credits and whether those are not typically given for pricey things like aircraft, or indeed for infrastructure exports to poorer countries that don't produce them, and hence can have also beneficial effects. And the other question is about the operation of the WTO in general, whether it would not just be time to throw consensus out of the window in general and start operating by majority decisions.
Okay, I mean, Kamala, this is directly addressed. So you're first, and the other ones, please prepare who want to do some kind of trying to answer this. All right, Kamala, please.
Thank you. I think the question is absolutely right. There is a real role for official export support. The point is that it shouldn't crowd out the commercial sector, and it shouldn't really be competing with the commercial sector. The traditional model was that it was a lender of last resort, and it really was to make sure that foreign buyers, particularly in developing countries who didn't have the collateral or the capital or the insurance because it was high risk, could access these. So it was very sort of pro-development in that way. I think what's happened now is that developed countries have seen this as a way of actually a double whammy. We can also use this money to make sure that we create our national champions. And it's not just about a subsidy race to the bottom, it's also about sustainability. There are lots of concerns about fossil fuel support and so forth. So while yes, there's a real role for them, there's a real even bigger role for monitoring them and making sure that they don't act in a way that's not actually conducive to a lot of things except for corporate welfare.
Thank you very much, Kamala. Now, who wants to take the very last one? Bob.
I'll start. Bernard, I'm sure will finish. In our survey, among the least support any question got was voting on operational matters. Trade people just don't seem keen on that sort of voting. Voting on substantive matters, we didn't even dare ask about. I think there would be no support for that. If you are going to have a new obligation that sovereign governments are going to accept and implement, that has to be accepted by consensus. But that, of course, means that on issues where there is a group of countries who want to move forward, maybe plurilaterals is the option. And here I hand over to Bernard.
Okay, so on that point, absolutely. And I think consensus in a significant, to a significant degree, has already bitten the dust in terms of countries now having admitted that getting to consensus is very difficult on many issue areas, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to insist on consensus, given that preferences clearly are often quite diverse, that not everybody thinks the same thing is a priority. So the key thing in terms of moving forward to agree to things on a plurilateral basis is to ensure that that doesn't undermine the rights and obligations of countries that are not part of the plurilateral agreements, right? And we have a paper on this as part of the Bertelsmann Stiftung project, which argues that one of the things that needs to be done by WTO members, especially those who are involved in plurilateral initiatives now, is that they have to agree on some kind of a code of conduct, rules of the road for members of plurilaterals, exactly to ensure that those who don't participate are not going to be penalized for doing so, and that these agreements are open to accession and participation by countries who want to do so later in time, but on conditions which are completely equivalent to those that applied to the incumbents, right? So there's a series of kind of principles which are developed there, which I think is very important for the WTO membership as a whole to start thinking about, and which we don't have today. Thanks.
Thank you, Bernard. Last chance, any missing comments from the speakers? This is not the case. Okay, then let me finally remind you that you please look at YouTube to find the links to all the papers, whether it's at Bertelsmann Stiftung or EUI. There you can find them. And let me first thank the speakers, but also you audience who kept with us for this whole time. As the WTO is the operating system of global trade, it has not received an update in a long time. We discussed that. The ideas we were discussing today could be elements of something between a bug fix maybe and a better version of a new WTO. But if there is no update on any kind, the number of bugs, as we know, will increase until the operating system isn't fit for purpose anymore. Don't let us waste this crisis. We must not let this happen. Thanks a lot for listening, and goodbye. See you again.
Okay, bye-bye all.